Now, this is the Khoodeela television channel broadcasting under the banner of Baby Angel Geronimo editions. This one is starting at 08:11 GMT, which is 4 minutes before the stated time. Now, one of the things that dominates, well, one of the main items on the front pages of the London Fleet Street so called British national newspaper front pages is the focus by the dirty digger Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch owned and manipulated brainwasher for the zombies, the Daily Scum, and the Scum is calling the BBC liars. Of course, that is not news to us, but even for the dirty digger Murdoch to so brazenly say that the BBC are liars is a significant event. Is it coming into the camera? I don't know. But this is the Murdoch Scum. Let's see if it can somehow be put in view. That's the Scum, the top of the Scum. Now this is the bottom of the page, front page. And just a flash, a glimpse. And it is saying that the parents are calling the BBC liars. I'll come to the parents, the definition of parents. So it's saying parents, BBC lied. That's what it is saying. Now, what the Scum is referring to as parents are the supposed parents of a supposed victim of supposed inappropriate sexual contacts by a supposed widely known BBC television presenter with this individual child, whether it's male or female, when this particular individual child was aged 17, which is covered by the definition of a child. Now, this individual is now aged 20. So, therefore, they are not a child anymore. But the complaint against the BBC, the allegation that the BBC lied collectively, refers to the period when this individual, the child at the time, was in contact with this BBC supposed presenter. And the Scum is saying today that the family of this individual, who is now 20, and it is not stated whether there were 20 in May, but the main subheading on top of this splash, and the splash is in the three words parents. BBC lied. The family of youth spent hours telling BBC their fears in May. And then there is a quote: "We only spoke out to help save vulnerable addict child." Now, what they mean by addict is that this child apparently is addicted to cocaine. And this BBC presenter apparently sent this child, whatever the mode of transaction was, £35,000 over a period of 3 years. And that this child spent the money, or the main part of the money, in buying the addictive drug cocaine. So that's what they're saying. Now, by any standard, this series or this collection of allegations is intended to make general public concerned, and also particularly parents of children more concerned. And the essential issue raised by this alleged behavior by this BBC presenter is the trust in the BBC, confidence in the BBC, which is the BBC uniquely is funded by what is called the license fee payers' money. It's a very thorny issue. The way the BBC actually collects the license fee money from individuals is very controversial and is very distressing to large numbers of people with low income who are harassed, threatened, intimidated, and cause any amount of distress. One of the things that has been on the table, political table in the United Kingdom for a very long time is that the license fee paid BBC is not accountable to the license fee payers. It's not accountable to the public. Now, as an active campaigner, I have been actively engaged in various aspects of the BBC's operations for 6 decades here, and I've been, before I came to the United Kingdom more than 50 years ago, I was an active student of the contents and the role of the BBC, especially by the BBC radio service, which, as I was accessing it, was called the world service of the BBC. And there is no evidence anywhere that the BBC is accountable. And this is not just about this particular episode or incident. The fact that the BBC's chairman Richard Sharp, or whatever the first name was involved in a sleazy set of relationships with the congenital liar Boris Johnson, for whom Sharp acted as a pimp, procuring money or credit for the congenital liar Boris Johnson. The whole episode, the whole series of the role that Richard Sharp played brought the BBC into disrepute. The BBC cannot be allowed to be in disrepute in this way. The contents of the BBC output, radio and television, may be organizationally different from the actual administration of the BBC bureaucracy. But the one thing that is dominant in both is that there is no culture of accountability for the BBC. Everything I have said in every campaign that has been featured in the BBC has been the truth and nothing but the truth. But I have had to, on each occasion, spend extraordinary amount of energy, resource, and time in getting across to the BBC individual factual decision makers of the veracity, the total veracity of what I was saying. So I don't know anything about this particular incident, but the culture that dominates the BBC is the culture that is not attributable to one individual. It's a culture that can only be imagined to belong to the domain of Satan. That's the only way I can put it. And whenever the BBC is forced into a position where it accepts the truth or any part of the truth, it only partially complies with the Holy Quran in the Surah Al-Isra. Innal batila kana zahuqa. Of course, the truth is indeed vindicated, but the BBC fights against the truth. Innal batila kana zahuqa. Now, this is the time. What time is it now? In the GMT time is now 08:25 in the morning of Tuesday, the 11th of July 2023, wherever anyone is watching this. And it says, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. That's one part of the sacred words in the Holy Quran. The truth has arrived and falsehood has disappeared. Indeed, innal batila kana zahuqa. Falsehood shall indeed disappear, perish. But the BBC clings on to the falsehood. Now, if that were bad enough, then the badness that is personified by Rupert Murdoch, the dirty digger. Can you believe this? Is 100 times worse. The dirty digger Rupert Murdoch is the personification of Batil, as is the entirety of the crew. As happened a few months ago in the USA, where the dirty digger was forced to settle out of court. The defamation action that a particular factual data provider about elections brought against Fox News. And that settlement is to the tune of $1 billion. Of course, the amount of money that Fox News makes and the dirty digger makes is many times $1 billion. But even so, $1 billion is a lot of money. And it's a symbolic representation of the admission by the criminal, Rupert Dirty Digger Murdoch, that he is a Satan and his whole business is a satanic operation. Regardless of whether and how many internal disputes and differences of opinion on a micro level he has had with the individual Satans fronting and confecting the various aspects of the Fox News operation. So, what we are looking at is the entire moral bankruptcy of the civilized world. Because these are the criminals and these are the criminal outlets that claim that the so called developing countries are not of the same standard of morality, transparency, and all the rest of it. That's a lie. And we could go into all the individual Western states and regimes. And what we could find, and we can find every single time, is that they are running, they're, they're out of the physical occupations of the countries that they occupied as empires and colonies. But they're doing something worse than physical colonization. They are perpetrating the moral bankruptcy as the norm. There is no accountability. And there is no room for truth, fairness, and justice. And there is no scope for holding the judicial bureaucracies to account. Why is judicial bureaucracy relevant? Because where do you go? If the particular service providers are misbehaving and are breaking the codes that are normally there and they should comply with, then that should be tested, checked, verified, and tried, examined by looking at their behavior. And that can be done only by checking the behavior through an independent tribunal or court of law. But the independence of a tribunal or court of law doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the UK, it doesn't exist in any of the Western European countries, and it most certainly doesn't exist in the Eastern European countries at all. When Aung San Suu Kyi led the genocide of the Muslims in 2016-17 in Burma, she did that without any intervention by the hocus pocus bogus judiciary that was in place in Burma. And of course, the genocide of the Muslims, the Rohingyas, was fronted by the Buddhists. Now, the Western world, the Western countries, Western media, and Western cultural platforms have adopted this criminal sleazeball called the Dalai Lama as the personification of everything liberal, tolerant, and all the rest of it. And this criminal has been silent about the massacres and genocides and rapes of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma by Buddhists in Burma. So, who do they adopt? The Western so called liberal media adopt a criminal wrongdoer like the Dalai Lama, who is a lecturer as well. He is their ideal religious deity that they favor. They, of course, don't want to accept anything to do with Muslims, and what they accept of the Hindus is not 100%, and they don't accept much of the Sikhs. So the only East derived, Eastern oriented quote religion is the Buddhist that the colonialists deign to accept or allow or tolerate. And the sleazeball, lecher, and sexual pervert Dalai Lama has been silent about the multiplicity of violations of humanity and human rights by the Burmese Buddhists against the Muslims. And there is no criticism of the Dalai Lama over that silence in the media, in the most certainly not by the Murdoch media, not even by the Guardian, not by the Observer, the Guardian Observer. And if it is true here in the United Kingdom, it is true also in Canada and the USA and in the rest of the Western European countries and capitals and outlets. Let's have the Western European languages: French, Italian, Greek, Swedish, Dutch, any of the languages, many of the languages that are in use in these countries. I mean, before I came to Europe, I was familiar with the written kind of appearance of these languages because I had access, due to my family background, if you like, access to variety of news prints. Of course, I wasn't taught these languages. And when I became familiar with the main English language ones, and I found a way to contextually, visually, and in other ways compare the relationship between these Western European language publications and the events in the Asian and African continents, let's say, it was increasingly obvious to me that although these countries differed from one another, let's say the French differed from the English and the British and the Germans and so on, essentially the outlook they actually hold about the world is very similar. It's racist, it is anti Muslim, and it is unrepentant about the racist crimes that they have committed during the actual physical years of colonialism, and they are continuing in the ideological way, which is what I was saying earlier. That although they gave up the physical occupations of these countries as colonies, the ideological occupation is having a worse impact on these countries and societies. Let's take a very pertinent example. The relationship between India, the Republic of India, and I'm talking about the 1960s when I started. Well, late 1950s, 1957 is when I began, but I mean, I began political activities in the mid 1950s, but the actual access to the newspapers I regularly began in the last 5 years of the decade, 1950s. There is no record in any language, French, Dutch, Swedish, English, Italian, Greek, whatever. There is no record of any of these languages recognizing any of the countries in the subcontinent as being equal to them or even existing. So when they talk about the boat people, the migrants, the asylum seekers posing a threat, what do they mean? They don't mean that the asylum seekers and the migrants are carrying any physical materials that can constitute lethal weapons. What they mean is that these refugees and migrants and asylum seekers are not brainwashed. and they will have to be brainwashed into behaving like zombies that would replicate what Robert Thomas Bevington Macaulay said. There would be on the outside there would be Indians, and on the inside there would be English. By that he meant that the brainwashing would be so complete that the Indians, apparently outside the Indians, because in the 1830s they were all Indians, not the state of Pakistan didn't exist or the Bangladesh didn't exist. That they would be doing the jobs without extra prompting. When the India born racist Raid Dyer, who committed the massacre in Amritsar in 1919 in cold blood, massacre of the innocents. He wasn't born in England, he was born in India, and he didn't have any hesitation before ordering the Indian born other troops to shoot nearly 100 innocent other Indians for daring to raise a protest about an injustice at that time. So we are quite a bit away from the BBC's lying and the dirty digger Rupert Murdoch's role in calling the BBC liars. That was 1919, which was just a few years before the BBC itself was founded in the 1920s. Even if the BBC had existed, the massacre in Amritsar, Gujranwala Bagh massacre, would not have been reported by the BBC. I don't think. So the row between the Murdoch control outlets, and the outlets include the Sun and the Times and the Sunday Times, as well as the radio that he has started, Times Radio. The row will continue, but they will not be talking about the essential criminality and the lying agenda that are being promoted by Murdoch's outlets. But the fact that the number of members of parliament have been prepared to go on the record or have been prepared to speak anonymously for the time being with some of the outlets, including The Guardian, about the BBC's behavior, which they call astonishing and unacceptable because the BBC has not named the individual presenter, although the BBC has suspended him. The fact that the members of parliament have even come to that point illustrates the emptiness of the media, moral emptiness, the emptiness of the parliament. And I'll explain why. Because while this is happening, this so called spat, the row, the exchange of accusation and counter accusation, etc., concerning one individual child, there are literally thousands of cases of abuse taking place across the United Kingdom every single 24 hours. And neither the BBC nor the members of parliament is reporting or showing any concern about any of those. And you add and multiply and extrapolate the cases of so many people in England going without basic food because of poverty and low income. Now, that going without food is not a joke. For any prolonged period of time, if people go without and have to go without food, if they're forced to go without food, they can lose all confidence, as happened with the claimants claiming from the DWP and the DWP stopping the benefits while George Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister of the United Kingdom, and Ian Dracula Duncan Smith was the Secretary of State, the cabinet member responsible for the Department for Denial, Deprivation, Wanton Poverty Creation, DWP. Part of the time was covered by Keir Starmer being in post of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And hundreds of people denied their benefits, welfare money, were forced to commit suicide. That is what poverty does to people. And that is what poverty and hunger and the fear of hunger, these are driving forces behind so many people from Africa and Asia seeking refuge in Western countries. But the United Nations agencies that are supposed to exist to deal with this kind of mass poverty and hunger and destitution, these are failing. These are failing, neglecting their duties to help masses of people, desperate people, in countries in Asia and Africa. And there is nothing the United Nations is failing to uphold the objectives, purpose of the founding of the behind the founding of the United Nations organization. None of these failures is being featured in the Scum, in the Times, in the Sunday Times, or the other Free State papers, or the counterparts in France or in Sweden. I say Sweden because Sweden, because of the political legacy left by Olof Palme and the first Secretary General of the United Nations, who was assassinated on board a plane while he was traveling in Africa. The Swedish have got a reference point allowing them to claim that they are not a repressive fascistic culture but a liberal one. Of course, that is not true on the ground, but that is the kind of myth. And the same case applies to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the government and the parliament are every day doing something to deny human rights, to silence people who are entitled to justice but are denied justice. But these behaviors, these activities and agendas are not being challenged by any of the papers, including the Guardian or the Observer. So, what we are looking at in the kind of front pages of the newspapers of Tuesday, 11th of July 2023, is a travesty, a distortion, a perversion of the truth. We shall be continuing on all of those in due course in the later editions. This is now ending at 43 minutes at 08:54 hours GMT on Tuesday, the 11th of July 2023.